Hello again folks, and this is another screencast in relation to sport and society, and this particular screencast we're going to be talking about public schools in the period between 1800 and 1914. Public schools were very exclusive at the time, mainly for two particular classes, initially for the upper classes in sort of the late and early sort of 1700s, and the middle class quickly followed suit as they came into wealth in terms of their factory wealth. They would then send their children to public schools. The reason these people could send children to public schools is because it often involved a large fee, and you'd pay this fee to the school, and the school would use that for some facilities or resources for the school, or to actually build the houses that the students would live in, because they all lived on site, as we'll come to in a minute. It was extremely expensive to attend. People came from various villages and towns to attend a public school, so they came from other areas to attend a public school. And they would board at this public school, and the way they would board at this public school is probably something that you know from your own school experience of something called a house system. The house system was the aspect of accommodation at the public school, and there were these big blocks, a bit like shown on the picture, where particular students would live and have their daily chores, and then they would come to be educated at the public school on site. So the whole area was one big site: school, education, accommodation. This quickly became the centre of sporting life for the boys, because they interacted with each other, and there were their friends, and they would then play games, simple games, with each other or against each other as part of their house. This quickly created the development of team games. Now, before we carry on, public schools at this time, until sort of mid-1800s even, were mainly for boys and boys only. Girls were or didn't have any sort of public school system. They were self-educated at home initially at the start of 1800s, until the public schools for girls became prominent, as I say, sort of mid-1800s onwards, and we'll talk about that in another screencast. Public schools went through three different stages between 1800 and 1914, and we call these three stages the three stages of athleticism. You need to understand what happened at each stage, but when you're talking about public schools, you view public schools as all of these stages together. So the exam questions often ask about the organisation of games and how games developed through public schools. Well, realistically, that happened between stage 2 and stage 3. So you think of these things as a whole, as opposed to different aspects. To summarise, the stages roughly, in a simplified way, are those on the screen. So you had the first stage, which involved lots of boy culture, lots of bullying, a bit of brutality, the formation of basic games. You have the second stage, which involved a bit more control over the boys and the development of inter-house games, so playing between themselves on the school site. And then in stage 3, there was this wide spread of games. We call that the cult of athleticism, which we'll meet later on, and the development and technical development of sport itself, which was then spread into society. So stage 1, roughly 1790 to 1824, and if you look at that time frame, you immediately think, well, this is a little bit of pre-industrial Britain as well as post-industrial Britain, so it crosses the time frame. The reason that's important is because the values associated with pre-industrial Britain, some of them were still here in the schools. So think about violence a little bit, think about cruel sports from villages. These sort of things that were going on in society would have been copied in the schools at the time. So what occurred was this idea of the boy culture. People from villages, when I say people I mean boys from villages, middle class boys and upper class boys would have been sent from their village to the public school from preparatory school. So preparatory school, a little bit like a primary school, it's their initial education for the middle and upper classes. They would then have progressed to the public school and they would have been sent to that public school. In the public school at the time, there were very limited lessons. You might have done a little bit of Latin, you might have done a little bit of English, but there was an awful lot of free time for the boys to have because it wasn't so structured. And because they were all living on site, you then had boys regularly fighting with each other. You had boys gaining access to alcohol and getting drunk. They would have jumped into local rivers and poached fish. They would have trespassed on farmers' land that was nearby to the public schools. They would have bunked off the 2 lessons a day. There would have been lots of unruly behaviour, little bit like popular recreation in terms of the pre-industrial era, in terms of what people were like in society. The boys sort of mimicked that, if you like. They would have torn up their textbooks and used the paper for particular games, simple games such as hare and hounds, where they would chase each other and follow a paper trail. The teachers at this time frame, so 1790 to 1824, were not interested in the boys' games. They were interested in teaching their subject and trying to get some education over to the boys, and that was it. Once their lesson had stopped, the buck would stop there. The boys would then have to amuse themselves. And so what eventually happened was boys started to organise little games between themselves for pure enjoyment, to take away the boredom of the day and the boredom of being educated. So it made it more fun for themselves. And what occurred there is something called the melting pot. The melting pot, at this point in time, consisted of boys creating games from the villages in which they came from. For example, you might have a public school in Birmingham, and boys might have come from villages as far as Sussex, Kent, Hampshire, etc. In those little villages, they would have played games local to that region. There might have been a game of mob football that was only specific to Sussex, a game of cricket that was only specific to Sussex, etc. And all these children would have met in the middle at this public school. They would have brought all their own games and ideas from the village, and they put them together. And we call this the melting pot. So when all these ideas come together, the children wouldn't discuss the games. It might have been the bigger children would have said, these are my rules, this is what we're playing. An idea would have come up and a game would have been created. And you would have had whole games created for an individual school at this point, and these boys would have understood the rules because that's what they'd made up. So this idea of melting pot and creating games started here in stage 1. This swiftly followed on with stage 2, and stage 2 was very important to public schools because of a certain individual and his ideas about how public school should happen. This individual was Dr. Thomas Arnold, who was head of Rugby School, big private public school, and Dr. Thomas Arnold really frowned upon the idea of boys fighting, boys out of control, boys playing cruel and violent games, boys' drunken behaviour. He wanted to reform these people and change their attitudes because in society at this time, you now look at the time frame 1824, the middle class would have tried to be civilising people, to educate them, to make them better people. And he thought he could do this through the notion of 2 things, through sport and through some form of social control. The first thing he did was he looked at the school. He thought, okay, I would like some form of police system put in place. And what he did was he gave responsibility to the sixth formers to become prefects. And these prefects would then monitor what was going on in the playground. They would monitor what was going on in the house system, and they would report back to Dr. Thomas Arnold or a staff member if things were going awry. So he had a little control system put in place. The second thing these prefects did was they started to arrange, under Dr. Thomas Arnold's ideas, inter-house games. What that meant was, if you were in a certain house, you'd all play a game for the afternoon. It might be a game of rugby, it might be a game of cricket, it might be a game that they brought from the melting pot, and they would have regular little competitions between their houses themselves and against other houses that were on the school site. So if you had 8 houses, the houses could play against each other. When they played against each other, we called that intra-house games. And this quickly developed the idea of games in public schools. What then occurred is we then had rules develop for these particular games that were created. For example, at Eton, very famous public school, they had a game called the Eton Wall game. And because people were regularly playing this game through intra-house competition, there had to be a set of rules, and these set of rules were established. The game could be played more regularly, and people got better at that game. At other schools, we had like the handling game, which was almost like a game of rugby, but with a round football. We had cloisters games, so games were played in corridors, different ball games, but there were rules created for these individual games, and the rules were only for that particular public school. That's quite important. The Eton Wall game was only played at Eton because we couldn't transport those rules around at this point in time. Because the boys were playing so many more games, this was Dr. Thomas Arnold's idea. It exhausted them. They didn't have time to fight. They didn't have energy to fight. They were constantly playing different games outside of their classroom activities. And so this led to a complete reduction in violence. It was still there in times, but it was reduced. And Dr. Thomas Arnold had some form of control over those boys' behaviour. And the civilising process started to begin. The final aspect that Dr. Thomas Arnold involved was something called muscular Christianity. So he was a very religious man and believed in the power of church, but he also believed in the power of sport. And he created this idea of muscular Christianity, and muscular Christianity defined is the combination of godliness and manliness, working hard for the glory of God. And he decided to promote this through the idea of sport. So playing hard for the glory of God. These things all added up to a complete civilising approach between 1824 and 1842, and the fast development of games and sporting activities within each individual public school. Because as I said before, at this point we haven't got regular transport, so it's only things that were going on in each school. The final stage of public schools is what we call the cult of athleticism. What we mean by a cult is that people became obsessed with the idea of something. You'll need a definition of athleticism for your notes because it's on the specification OCR. So it's the combination of physical endeavour, so trying hard, with moral integrity, so truthfulness, sportsmanship, honour. And it's basically a progression of muscular Christianity from stage 2. It's moved on a stage. We've sort of lessened the religious element of something, but we've kept those same values of people playing sport because of this moral integrity, moral values. And what quickly developed were values with each particular sport. So people were encouraged to play sport at public schools to develop values within themselves. The values we associate with public schools can be used as the acronym athleticism. So I'll spell that, which is on the screen. And what I'd like you to do is try to write down a value that's associated with every letter of the word athleticism. For example, if I played team sport, such as rugby at the time, it might develop my loyalty to my own house because I would have played for my house. It might develop my own sportsmanship. So these were values that were starting to be developed by playing sport more regularly. On the screen we've got 3 specific sports that would have been played by boys at public schools at the time. So, just to recap, the first task is to write down the word athleticism and try to think of a value that would be associated with it by playing a sporting activity. The second task, I've got 3 typical boys' sports on the screen, so football, rugby and cricket that would have been played at the time. Can you use your values, such as loyalty, and explain how they would have been shown through each activity? So how would loyalty have been shown through playing rugby? So link a practical example to it. Alongside this, in society, the British Empire was starting to rule the seas, and it was starting to gain territories in different areas of the world. And one of the things about the British Empire was it was trying to civilise the areas that it invaded. That was one of its primary aims. Obviously it didn't completely do that in certain areas, but that's for the history buffs. The interesting thing for us is what happened with the British Empire is as students at public schools left the public school, they then took with them the games that they were playing at public school and started to play them against other army officers or the local population in each different area of the world. And this is task number 3. What I'd like you to do, please, is look at the map of British Empire colonies. I mean, this is going forward in time to around about 1950 in terms of the Commonwealth colonies. But can you look at the map and write down 3 British Empire colonies and what sports we would have given them from the public schools to play in their native country, and that was then taken on to play with popular effect. So that's task 3. What the examiner is going to ask you is what was the effect of public schools on sport and the organisation of sport. So we've talked about boys developing their own games, we've talked about prefects, we've talked about intra-house games, we've talked about some rules for some sports in some games only limited to the public school. Well, now stage 3 has come in and we're thinking about the time frame. The railway has been developed. People are leaving public schools and going on to other things. So this would have impacted on how sport then progressed. In stage 3, headmasters saw the value of games. They saw the athleticism values and they wanted to put sport on the curriculum, make it more formal, get boys playing more and more sport. There's a value in this. So that is one thing that happened to the organisation of games. Because it was on the curriculum more often, competition developed. And when you play games more regularly against other schools, because we could do that now because of the railway, technique would have been improved. You would have had the development of a game, the structure and the rules of things. This meant that new facilities developed, changing rooms developed, goalposts would have been developed, diving boards would have been developed for activities such as swimming. We also now had not just intra-school games, so within the school itself, played by the houses. Because of the railway, we had inter-school fixtures. They could play each other from large distances. Eton can play Harrow in a public school game of cricket. That increased technique, increased competition. We also had sports days happen at the end of a academic year. This was something the headmaster really encouraged because it attracted publicity to the school. It made a name for the school. It promoted some of the boys in terms of their sporting prowess. As these sports were developing at such a rapid rate, we then had games committees being formed in public schools. So a games committee would look after the tennis for that particular school, the cricket for that particular school, the rugby for that particular school, and they might meet up with other public schools' games committees and discuss the way forward for that particular sport. This led to further codification of rules. It led to standardised rules because schools were playing each other. They had to have one set of rules to play by. The games committees also then overviewed the rules, so started to form those rules together. The other thing that's not on this slide was that new games were also being developed. Things such as table tennis, things such as water polo, badminton. These other new games were starting to become developed in society as this idea progressed. So this cult of athleticism and this increased obsession with sport meant that team games and sport was really starting to pick up at this point in time. As I say, this is just what's happened with the public schools so far. The thing that accelerated sport in society was what happened to those public school boys once they left school. The majority of them would have gone to one of the two bigger universities at the time, Oxford or Cambridge, and we call that Oxbridge for those that are informed with those universities. If you went to one of those two big universities, they were very keen on sport. They were similar to the public schools. They liked the values of sport, and you could represent the university, either Cambridge or Oxford, at a particular sport, such as football, cricket, athletics, swimming. If you represented Cambridge and played against Oxford, or if you represented Oxford and played against Cambridge, you were called an Oxbridge Blue. It was a big thing to be, and it was quite an important status act. When those ex-public schools finished university, they would have then been quite sought after by the public schools because they had this Oxbridge Blue tag. And the public schools then employed the Oxbridge Blues as coaches or assistant masters in sporting activities. So you would have had someone who represented Cambridge at swimming against Oxford, would have been hired by a public school as an Oxbridge Blue, and they would have taught or helped coach students in public schools aspects of swimming. And so quickly this turnaround and this process would have accelerated sport even more, and technical development, so strokes and different aspects of cricket, different aspects of football, would have sped up and developed very quickly. Okay, this is task 4. Now on task 4 we have a slide here that shows on the left hand side the different jobs that ex-public school boys would have gone on to do. We use this acronym called TOPVIC. So ex-public school boys would have become teachers, army officers, that's the O, parents, vicars or priests, industrialists, so they would have worked in a factory or owned a factory, and community members or community leaders, politicians. Using the screen, can you now match up what would have happened on the right in terms of the development of sport in any way in relation to the TOPVIC acronym? The final aspect of this public school, ex-public school boy mitigation, if you like, is then what happened at the universities to further develop sport. So bear in mind, we've started to develop general rules at public schools. We've got this idea of some games committees at public schools. Those boys would have then left the public school onto Oxford or Cambridge, and at this point they would have met up and there would have been a second melting pot. So they've had all their ideas from Eton, all their ideas from Harrow, all their ideas from Charterhouse, public schools. They would have met up and discussed those rules and standardised the common set of rules. What were the common themes of those games? This is now the new set of rules for football overall, because we've now standardised the whole thing, and therefore codification was increased. As I mentioned previously, other sports started to develop. Water polo, table tennis, badminton, hockey, traditional British Empire sports, and those would have been standardised and those would have moved on a stage at this point. Because these games were played at university regularly, more competition, technical developments would have been made. The technique would have been better for particular skills in those activities. That meant that standards of performance increased. And if those boys then would have left, become teachers at their old public schools, and more public schools boys would have then gone into university, this whole process was speeding up rapidly, and the development of lots of games and lots of sports would have been rapidly increased. The final thing that occurred at universities was that games committees moved on a stage. They then became national governing bodies. So we had the formation of the Amateur Athletics Association, AAA, in 1866, the Rugby Football Union in 1871, the Football Association in 1863, and the LTA in 1888, as well as other sports that were being developed at the time. We had these national governing bodies develop all in this time period. So Britain became the epicentre of sport and sporting life. And then if you think those people would have then gone on to spread it elsewhere, it was how Britain established these sporting games and took them to the world. Okay, in the last screencast we did a timeline activity in which I asked you to draw a line, split it in half, put 1900, 1800, first half and second half. What I'd like you to do now is, if you still have space on that previous timeline, you can add this in. Otherwise, you can create a new timeline for the different aspects that I'm now going to put on the screen. I'd like you to complete this. This is task 5, to complete this timeline. You might need to pause it. There's quite a lot of stuff to look at. You'll need Wikipedia and some other sort of search engine to see in terms of the time frames of some of these things. So here is the list. Again, thanks for watching. If you need more help and support on any aspect of Sport and Society or any other aspect of OCRPE, please pop over to the iSpeakpe channel here on YouTube.